So students ask me, oh man, I don't really know which events go with which president. So I'll do my best to sort of hit the highlights of not each president, but many presidents along the way. So of course we know that George Washington was the first president, the only president unanimously elected. At the same time, he didn't have a party. The Democratic, Republicans, and the Federalists sort of emerged out of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists during his time in office, but he didn't have a party. Now, he certainly seemed to ally more with the Hamiltonian side in his Secretary of Treasury rather than with Jefferson, his Secretary of State. So it's important to know that under George Washington, you're going to have the whole idea of Hamilton, a fat white bus man. Remember, that's funding at par, that's assumption of state debts, that's a tariff, that is the Bank of the United States, the whiskey tax, also known as the excise tax, and then an emphasis on more of an industrial manufacturing rather than agriculture. At the same time, you remember that the Federalists were people that were more pro-Britain, whereas Jeffersonian Republicans or Democratic Republicans tended to be more on the side of France. And Britain and France are fighting each other, as they always seem to be, and when given the opportunity of who to choose, Washington says he wants to stay neutral. He realizes that the country is too young, too fragile, and that if they get in the war and they lose, that could be the end of this Republican, that's Republican not as in the party, experiment. Now, of course, people that are allied with the French, like Jefferson, say, how dare you not honor the Franco-American alliance that goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War when the French came in on the side of the colonists after the Battle of Saratoga. As a result of Hamilton's excise tax, there were farmers who felt like they were being unduly persecuted because much of the way that they actually traded was actually take their grain and turn it into alcohol, and they felt like they were being taxed more than everybody else. So they rose up and supposedly were going to be a threat, much like we saw with Daniel Shays after the Revolution, but instead actually Washington marches out himself and really sort of killing a fly with a sledgehammer shows that this federal government is going to be strong and it's not going to be weak like it was in Shays' Rebellion. Now, when we also look here, we want to talk about an effort to sort of end all of the impressment that is going on of American ships. So John Jay is going to go to Britain to try to negotiate with the British to basically end all of this. Listen, we had the Revolutionary War. Let's end this antagonism already. Yet Hamilton doesn't want trade relations with Britain hurt, so he sort of undermines what Jay is doing, and in the end, the United States ends up having to sort of give in to Britain more than telling Britain what it wants. And so it looks back to many people in the United States like we were bowing down to Britain, and people said, didn't we win the war? Why are we doing this? Yet to the French, it seemed like we were actually getting back in bed with Britain. So people in the United States were particularly pissed at Washington. It looked like either that we had failed and we were weak relative to Britain, or if we were back in bed with Britain, there were people that were Francophiles that were upset. Now, the last place we want to go is Washington's farewell address, which people often confuse with the Neutrality Proclamation. This is not about neutrality. It's about isolationism. And what he's effectively arguing is that the United States cannot involve itself in entangling alliances, not temporary alliances, but the kind of alliances that will make us come to, our allies' aid, even if we don't necessarily want to. Of course, he's talking about the Franco-American alliance. He also worries openly about what's happening with political parties. Again, it's nowhere in the Constitution that says anything about political parties. He didn't have membership in a political party, yet he's worried about what this will do to the country. John Adams was Washington's vice president, and then he becomes the second president himself. He is the first and only official Federalist president. Now, what we want to pay attention to here is a sequence of events where, again, he's going to try to deal with France. So he's going to be anti-French because he's a Federalist, and he's pissed off about the continuing impressment. So he sends diplomats to France who are met by these agents X, Y, and Z who say, you got to pay us $250,000 to even talk to the big guy, Talleyrand. So the Americans say, we will not pay any of this bribery money, and they come home. There's sort of a very strong anti-French sentiment. How dare they do this to us? And so what you're going to have is an opportunity for the Federalists using this anti-French sentiment to go after the Democratic Republicans, who are pro-French. So using this opportunity, they create the Alien Act, which is going to limit immigrants' so that it takes longer for them to actually gain citizenship, in part hurting the Democratic Republicans who relied much more on immigrants. It's going to make it easier for the president to deport people in times of war. And then at the same time, you got something called the Sedition Act, which says you can't say anything bad about the Federalist Party. Well, there are people who said this is obviously unconstitutional, particularly the First Amendment, but the Supreme Court, who was dominated by Federalists, didn't say anything about it. So it went to Madison and Jefferson, again, Democratic Republicans, who were going to argue in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that the states, not the federal government, has the right to determine if a law is unconstitutional. And they use what's known as compact theory that says the states existed before the federal government. We, the states, created you, the federal government, so we can make decisions about what happens in the federal government. And if we don't like them, ultimately we could potentially secede. Now, these resolutions go nowhere. No other states pick them up. But in the end, Thomas Jefferson does beat John Adams in 1800, moving from the Federalists, who again wanted ideas like funding in part and assumption of state debt and tariffs and Bank of the United States and loose interpretation of the Constitution, to moving to the Democratic Republicans, who wanted a strict interpretation of the Constitution, didn't want the bank, didn't want a tariff as they felt it hurt farmers. And so this, what ended up being a peaceful transition from one party to the other, what seemed to be an opportunity for Jefferson to get rid of everything that had stood before him under the Federalists. But in fact, the big deal is he kept the Bank of the United States. He did get rid of the tariff and he did get rid of the excise tax, but he didn't throw out everything. Now, it's important to realize that one piece of the Adams administration that is going to come up is the midnight judge's appointment. So right as he's essentially going out of office, he appoints a bunch of judges who are Federalists to try to keep that federalism alive in the judicial branch. Well, as the case may be, one guy didn't end up getting his job, Marbury, and through a number of steps ends up with a case of Marbury versus Madison, James Madison, the Secretary of State, in front of John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who effectively doesn't feel like he can do stuff with the actual case, but he feels like he can invalidate a law back from early 1790s. So in the end, he says, this case gives us the power of judicial review, that in fact the federal government can rule on the constitutionality of laws passed by Congress, not the states, which is what Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were arguing. So Marbury versus Madison gives power, obviously, to the federal government over the state governments. Also in 1803, you have the Louisiana Purchase. Now, Thomas Jefferson had sent people to France to buy New Orleans, hoping that we could at least get the opportunity at the end of the Mississippi for his people, the farmers, to send their grain down there where it could be picked up in New Orleans. But once they get to France, they find out that Napoleon is looking to basically give up his North American empire because his whole deal in Santo Domingo, which is now Haiti, had really fallen apart. So he offers the United States the Louisiana Territory for $15 million. Now, Jefferson can't find anywhere in the Constitution that would give him that right to buy the land from another country. And again, the sort of strict interpretation of his principles, he's like, I just can't do it. But the Democratic Republican, the leadership said, man, you've got to do this. This would be great for our people. So again, he becomes much more of a loose interpreter of the Constitution for this case, whereas the Federalists, who realize that they're going to lose out because all of this land will be farming land for the Democratic Republicans, they stick to a strict interpretation. In the end, America buys the Louisiana Purchase, which is going to really change the trajectory of the United States from there on out. But the other big piece that is going on is this continued impressment of American sailors by British, and also that the British seem to be hanging around out west. They never really vacated their forts as they were supposed to as a result of the Treaty of Paris at the end of the Revolutionary War. So there continues to be tension with Britain, but Jefferson is not ready to take us to war. Even when the Chesapeake, the American ship, is fired upon by the Leopard for allegedly having British supporters on board, Jefferson doesn't go to war. He realizes that cooler heads need to prevail. Even though many people are upset, they don't go to war. But he realizes he has to do something. And so instead of having a neutrality proclamation like Washington had, he really has an economic neutrality proclamation, which is the Embargo Act, where he says the United States will not trade with anybody, hoping to use that economic leverage to get really Britain and France to come crawling back to us. But the Embargo Act seems to be hurting everybody. It hurts those in the North who trade with Britain. It hurts those in the South who ship their goods to the North to trade with Britain, so no one's happy about it. And so in a series of events, it actually says, well, we're going to trade with everybody, but not Britain or France, and Then we realize that we basically only trade with Britain and France, and then it says, okay, we'll trade with whoever wants us first, Britain or France, and France realizes that there's nothing to lose, so they say they'll work with us, which leaves Britain, who says, we don't need to do this, we're still the strongest navy in the world. So ultimately, the War of 1812 is going to start not under Jefferson, but under his successor, James Madison, and it's really going to be about the two ideas, freedom of the sea, and then basically being free from Indian attacks out west, along with his ideas of sort of emerging nationalism and, listen, didn't we beat you in the Revolutionary War? Why are we still doing this? And again, the hopes of maybe getting British Canada and maybe even Florida because Spain was allied with Britain. Now, also happening under Madison really is the events at the end of the War of 1812. Now, it was not a very successful war for much of it. The Democratic Republicans, the party that got the United States into war, weren't looking very strong, and this seemed to be an opportunity for the Whigs to really sort of get their groove back. And so a group meets at the Hartford Convention, effectively trying to use their leverage of a bad war to force their agenda back into play. So again, they're going to make claims like, we want to make sure that you couldn't have a president from the same state 2 times in a row, which is going after the Virginia dynasty, that you can only have 1 term as president, that get rid of the 3/5 clause, make it much harder to ever have an embargo or bring in new states, which would all come out of the Louisiana Territory. So they had these demands, and they thought they could be met using the leverage of, again, this losing war. And then, of course, what they find out is after the Treaty at Ghent and the Battle of New Orleans, that the war had actually been a win, despite the fact that it was a tie, and so that's really the end of the Federalist Party. It's not that important to know about Monroe per se, but again, he's a Virginian, he's a Democratic Republican, but he presides for 8 years over the era of good feeling, that feeling that came after sort of the second win despite a tie over the British, this feeling of emerging nationalism. There's only one party in play, the Whigs are really dead. Yet, in as much as there's sort of this emphasis of coming together, as you see with Henry Clay's American system, which is, again, banking, tariffs, and a network of roads, which never really got passed altogether, but this idea of the country coming together, you also have some other issues that are going on that are tearing the country apart. So you have the first panic, the Panic of 1819, where farmers feel like they're really being forgotten and in many ways sort of squeezed out by the Bank of the United States, which is really going to motivate Andrew Jackson in the election of 1824. You're going to see the Missouri Compromise in 1820, trying to figure out how do we let a new state in out of the Louisiana Territory, choosing the 3630 line, which is the southern border boundary of Missouri, but Missouri got to come in as a slave state and Maine as a free state. But again, a band-aid, a compromise brought to you by the great compromiser Henry Clay, but we know that band-aids do come off. Yet in sort of the spirit of sort of international affairs, there will be the Monroe Doctrine, which is, again, sort of a big bark from a little dog, which is to say, all European countries, you cannot be involved in the Americas. Don't try to colonize over here, and in return, we won't interfere in your affairs, which is somewhat laughable because we didn't have the power to get involved in their affairs. And the protection of the Americas only really worked because the British Navy was involved. They wanted to be able to benefit economically from the Americas. Now, this was never an official law, and in fact, many European countries just dismissed it, but it became a precedent for American presidents for a very long time. All that we really need to know about John Quincy Adams happened in his election in 1824, where you had 4 people running. They were all Republicans. You had John Quincy Adams, you had Henry Clay, you had Andrew Jackson, and a guy named William Crawford, and each sort of represented a different area. At the end of the day, Andrew Jackson got the most votes, but he didn't win enough votes to become president, and so in that particular case, as a result of the 12th Amendment, it went to the House of Representatives, which Henry Clay controlled. Now, Henry Clay, quote-unquote, struck a corrupt bargain with John Quincy Adams. We never know if that's the case, but John Quincy Adams got to be president. Henry Clay got to be Secretary of State, which for many people was a launching pad for their presidency. Unfortunately, Henry Clay ran 3 times and never won. But this idea of a corrupt bargain was what really put Andrew Jackson in the White House in 1828. So even though he didn't win in 1824, the country was really moving away from the elitism of a John Quincy Adams, again, the son of a president, a Northeasterner, a New Englander, as the power of the country was moving further out west and, quote-unquote, more to the people, as we're going to see in the presidency of Andrew Jackson.